All right, so today we're gonna dive into something that I think a lot of people struggle with when they're learning English.
Okay.
It's overthinking.
Uh-huh.
Overthinking when you're trying to speak English. And we're going to be looking at a podcast episode that really digs deep into this problem.
Interesting.
A lot of English learners, they get stuck in their heads instead of actually like opening their mouths and practicing.
Right.
Yeah.
You'd think the more you learn about a language, the more comfortable you would be speaking, but sometimes it can actually make you more self-conscious.
Exactly. Like you're afraid to make a mistake or you're worried about how you sound.
Mm-hmm.
And this podcast episode, it really explores the psychology behind all of that. And it points out that even native English speakers,
Right.
like you and me, we don't speak perfectly all the time.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We hesitate, we make little grammar mistakes. Maybe we even use the wrong words sometimes.
All the time.
But it doesn't stop us from speaking, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've kind of gotten to a point where we're just fluent and we don't even think about it too much.
Right, and I think that's the key difference. It's like learners have this inner critic that's constantly judging them, and it like blocks the natural flow of conversation.
Yeah, that they're trying to edit themselves before they even say anything.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And this podcast makes a really good point about how native speakers, we actually think in English. We don't translate from our native language to English in our heads.
Right.
We just think directly in English. And that's so important for fluency.
I think that's something a lot of learners don't realize. They get so caught up in translating every single word that it slows them down.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to drive a car while constantly looking at a map instead of just feeling the road and trusting their instincts.
Yeah, good analogy.
And speaking of instincts, you know how babies learn language?
Mm-hmm.
They don't have grammar books or dictionaries. They just listen, absorb, and imitate.
And they're not afraid to make mistakes.
Right. They're not self-conscious at all. They're just excited to communicate.
That's a good point.
So maybe we can all learn a little something from babies, embrace that childlike curiosity and fearlessness.
I like that.
Because fluency isn't about perfection. It's about expressing yourself and connecting with others.
Absolutely.
So the question is, how do we help learners shift their mindset and, actually start speaking without that constant overthinking?
Well, this podcast offers some really interesting techniques. And I think it all starts with a simple but really important shift: thinking in English.
Thinking in English. Okay, so how do you actually do that?
Well, one of the techniques they talk about is something they call narrating your life.
Narrating your life. What's that?
It's basically like becoming your own commentator, describing everything you're doing throughout the day in English.
Oh, interesting. So like if I'm making breakfast in the morning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You would be saying things like, okay, I'm grabbing the coffee, I'm pouring it into the filter, I'm turning on the coffee machine, just describing every little step.
Okay, so it's kind of like I'm immersing myself in an English-speaking environment, even if I'm just at home by myself.
Yeah, exactly. And it might feel weird at first, but the more you do it, the more natural it becomes.
So you're basically training your brain to think in English instead of constantly translating.
Exactly. You're creating new neural pathways.
That makes sense. And the podcast also talks about something called chunking.
Oh yeah, chunking is a great technique.
What is that?
Well, it's basically learning to group words together into meaningful units instead of focusing on individual words.
So like phrases or expressions.
Exactly. It helps you speak more fluently because you're not thinking about every single word separately.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's say you want to say, I'm going to the store to buy some milk. Instead of thinking, I then am, then going, you can chunk it as going to the store and buy some milk.
Got it. So you're like pre-building these chunks of language that you can then use in different situations.
Exactly. And it frees up your mental energy to focus on what you want to say.
That's really helpful. And the podcast also emphasizes the importance of actually speaking out loud.
Yes, even if you don't have someone to talk to.
Right. So how can you practice speaking if you're by yourself?
Well, they suggest things like self-talk and shadowing.
Self-talk. So just talking to yourself in English.
Yeah, you can describe what you see around you. You can retell a story you read, or even have imaginary conversations.
And what about shadowing?
Shadowing is when you listen to audio or video of native speakers and repeat after them.
Oh, okay. So you're trying to copy their pronunciation and rhythm.
Exactly. It's a great way to improve your pronunciation and get a feel for the natural flow of English.
That sounds like a fun way to practice. And here's something that I found really interesting. The podcast actually encourages learners to let go of the need for perfect grammar. At least in the beginning stages of speaking practice.
Wait, so are you saying grammar isn't important?
No, grammar is definitely important for clear communication, but the point they're making is that too much focus on grammar when you're trying to speak can actually block your fluency.
Oh, I see. So it's more important to just get your message across.
Exactly. And think about it when you speak your native language. You don't stop and think about every single grammar rule.
That's true.
You just speak naturally, and your brain takes care of the grammar.
So how do we help learners get to that point with English? I guess it takes practice and maybe a shift in mindset.
Yeah, the podcast suggests that instead of aiming for perfect grammar, learners should focus on communicating their ideas clearly, even if they make a few mistakes along the way.
That makes sense.
It's like giving yourself permission to be imperfect.
And to learn from your mistakes.
Exactly, because making mistakes is part of the learning process.
For sure.
It's like giving yourself permission to make mistakes and experiment and to trust that you'll get the grammar eventually.
Yeah, just like when you're learning an instrument, you don't start by trying to play a concerto.
Right.
You learn the basic chords and scales first.
And then eventually the music starts to flow.
Exactly.
And this podcast also talks about embracing discomfort
Yeah.
and how discomfort is actually a sign that you're growing, especially in language learning.
When you step outside of your comfort zone,
Mm.
when you challenge yourself to speak, even when you're nervous, that's when the real learning happens.
It's like pushing yourself in a workout.
Yeah.
It's hard in the moment, but afterward, you feel great.
You realize you're capable of more than you thought.
And the podcast says every time you speak, even if you stumble, you're actually rewiring your brain and building new connections.
You're getting closer to fluency.
And it's important to celebrate those small victories, like when
Yeah.
you express yourself clearly or when you understand a native speaker without having to translate.
Those are great moments.
And they remind listeners that fluency isn't a destination.
It's a journey.
Yeah, it's about enjoying the process and constantly improving.
Exactly.
And they end with this really powerful question: what are you waiting for? If you want to speak English fluently, just start speaking.
Stop overthinking. Stop waiting for the perfect moment.
It's a call to action.
It is.
It's like they're saying you have the power to achieve your goals.
And you don't need anything special.
Right?
You don't need any fancy resources. You already have everything you need.
The desire to learn, the willingness to practice, and the courage to make mistakes.
It's a really empowering message.
It is.
Fluency is within reach for anyone who's willing to put in the effort.
Absolutely.
It's so true. And I love how they tie it all together with this idea of just taking action.
Yeah, action is key.
Like, stop waiting for the perfect moment and just start speaking.
Just dive in.
And they even say, you don't need any fancy resources or expensive courses.
Nope.
You already have everything you need.
Exactly. You have the desire to learn.
Right. The willingness to practice.
And the courage to embrace those mistakes.
Exactly. Because mistakes are proof that you're learning and growing.
They are.
So it's really about shifting your mindset from fear and perfectionism to this idea of embracing the journey.
The journey of learning English.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And trusting that you'll get there eventually and enjoying the process along the way.
Yes, because learning a language should be fun.
It should be.
So to wrap things up today, I think the biggest takeaway from this deep dive is that fluency comes from action, not overthinking.
It does.
So if you're serious about improving your English speaking skills, stop letting those doubts and fears hold you back.
Just start speaking.
Exactly. Even if it's just to yourself in the mirror.
Every little bit of practice helps.
And remember, mistakes are okay.
They are.
They're part of the learning process.
Embrace them.
Exactly. So that's it for our deep dive today.
Thanks for joining us.
We hope you found this episode helpful and inspiring.
And we hope you'll keep those conversations flowing.
Until next time, happy speaking, everyone.